Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here at St. John the Baptist, and I'm offering you part two, number two in my series on the meaning and power of Jesus' resurrection for our lives and our world. In the first video, I focused on a passage from chapter 20 of John's Gospel, verses 19 to 23, where the risen Jesus appears in the upper room to his terrified disciples. And I explained how when he appears to them, he says to them, peace, shalom. He says peace to them twice. Then he breathes on them and then sends them out to forgive people. And in that video, I emphasized the three Old Testament hopes that are fulfilled in that event. The first hope is the hope for an age of peace in which there be no more wars, no more violence, where families and friendships and nations would be reconciled. We would be reconciled with God. Secondly, there was the Jewish hope for the restoration and renewal of God's people, a new covenant where God would take out their stony hearts and give them a heart of flesh and pour God's Spirit into them. And then the third hope that was found in the prophet Isaiah was for a new heaven and a new earth. The transformation of all of creation, the entire cosmos, where God is the center of all things. And my point last time was that when we proclaim that Jesus has been raised from the dead, what we believe and what that passage from John is telling us is that those powerful Jewish hopes were beginning to be realized. The resurrection of the dead means that God's new age of peace has begun to dawn through Jesus. That the restoration and renewal of God's people, the renewal of hearts and minds, the possibility of healing and forgiveness is now possible through Jesus. And with the breathing of the Spirit of God onto us, Jesus has begun the renewal and recreation of all things. Now, I want you to appreciate something when you start to understand that that's what the resurrection of Jesus means. Not just that when we die we go to heaven, but that into this world of violence and hostility and division has come God's new life through Jesus. Now, picture what this means if you're St. Paul, who has spent his whole life hoping for this age of peace, for the renewal of God's people, for God's new creation. Well, here's what Paul says in his letter he wrote to the Christians in Philippi. This is in chapter 3, starting in verse 8. He says, I calculate everything as a loss because of knowing King Jesus as my Lord is worth far more than anything else put together. And then he goes on and he says, I now calculate that all before this was trash, so that I may profit to be with the Messiah. And I have discovered that to be in him and to know him and to know the power of his resurrection and to know the partnership in his suffering means more than anything else. I consider everything else rubbish, Paul says, compared to knowing the power of the resurrection. Now, if you realize that for Paul, the resurrection is the dawning of the age of peace, the restoration of God's people, the renewal of all things, of course, everything prior to that is meaningless compared to what God has begun to do now. So, that's the first thing I want you to notice this week, is why this is so significant, why it is the earth-shattering, decisive event in human and cosmic history. Here's the second thing I want you to notice. and it has to do with direction. You know, there's a lot of Christian piety, a lot of Christian preaching, and often some hymns that emphasize that the Christian life is about going from here and getting into heaven. And that's the direction they imply the Christian life is about. But if you read the stories of Jesus' ministry, and you read the stories of Jesus appearing to his disciples, you will start to notice the exact opposite. That the Christian life is about heaven coming to earth. It's what we pray for in the Our Father. In these appearances of the risen Jesus, what you're getting is Jesus bringing the life of heaven to earth, to his disciples, to us. My friends, the direction of the Christian life is not from here to heaven, done by our efforts. No, the direction of the Christian life is God, who has, out of his love and generosity, decided to come to us through Christ and the Spirit and share divine life with us. Our job is to say yes and to cooperate with it. Here's the third point I want to highlight today. And it takes us back to that scene in the upper room. If it is true that the resurrection means that God's new age of peace, God's restoration, God's new creation have begun to dawn in Jesus' disciples, and we are those disciples, then as a church, as parishes, as Christian marriages and friendships, we then should reflect the peace of Christ. We should be people whose hearts and minds and relationships are being renewed and restored. We should be people of forgiveness. We should be the place where people can begin to see the renewal and the new creation happening on earth through Jesus and the Spirit. I look forward to talking to you next time.